Today is February 17th, 2025, and this is episode 297 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me today, as always, is Mr. Andrew Kalat.
Dangerously close to 300.
I know, which is still 703 away from 1,000, which is when we actually figure this out, right?
Right, unless we're doing it in some sort of like base 2, in which case it'd be 1024 would be the episode we get it by.
Fair enough.
And also, your lighting game is far superior to mine. I am shamed by your lighting game. I just want to point that out for the record.
So I over the years I've been accumulating lots of different lighting, so I'm actually putting it to use now.
That's fair. It's making you look as good as you possibly can.
Which is still pretty bad.
I didn't say that part.
It's all good. Everybody else is thinking it. So
it's great to see you in such amazing lighting. And I'm going to enjoy it while I can, because it's not ever going to get any better.
It's true. All right. So just a reminder that the thoughts and opinions we express on the show are ours and not those of our employers. And also a sincere thank you to all of our Patreon donors. We really, really appreciate you. You help us keep the lights on. And by the way, we are we're very open to more donors. So if you want to do so, you can find our Patreon link. It'll be in the show notes here. But also you can just go to patreon.com/defensivesec, SEC at the end, and you can sign up there. So again, thank you very much.
Make sure you get that C, not an X. That's a whole different type of podcast.
Which,
We'll add it to our podcast empire.
Yes. All right. I know what I'm doing tonight. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So, getting into our stories, the first one comes from Security Dive. And the title here is Ransomware Gangs Shifting Tactics to Evade Enterprise Defenses. This one was very timely because we've talked about this a couple of times in recent episodes about how we're starting to see some shifts in tactics, and most likely we're going to see further shifts. And I think we speculated a little bit on what that would look like. And I would summarize this article as saying that the major shift that's underway right now is getting away from encrypting data as an attribute of a ransomware attack and focusing more on stealing your data and holding its disclosure for ransom. So basically pay us money, or we're going to release your data into the wild. Which I find interesting because it doesn't, a lot of the harm, I suppose there is a benefit if a ransomware gang doesn't actually release it. There's a net benefit in terms of, not reduced harm to the end victims. Because usually this involves personal data of customers. Sometimes it can involve trade secret data or whatnot. But the preponderance of these seem to address or to impact personal data, or at least the ones that we hear about. Maybe this happens a lot more frequently, and we only hear about the ones that involve personal data because those are the only ones that have reporting requirements. But
that could be.
I guess my point is that if it does involve personal data, typically you're going to see the victim having to disclose and kind of bear a lot of the pain that comes along with the attack anyway. And so it leads me to wonder, like, what's the net benefit in actually paying the ransom
It's a good point.
in
It's an interesting
in
point.
that
Yeah.
case. So,
Yeah. The way I kind of read into this is it's interesting in that I might be able to have a little bit easier target environment if I'm only looking to exfiltrate data than I am looking to cripple an organization. So, for instance, typically in the olden days, 3 years ago, when ransomware got in, they would try to spread laterally, then encrypt a whole bunch of things at once and shut down a big operation. Well, what if I now just have access to just a couple of devices? Maybe I've started with a phishing attack against an executive. And so now really all I've got is maybe I can't go laterally very easily, but I've got access to that executive's data. Maybe there's some juicy stuff in there that they don't want disclosed. And maybe that's powerful enough to motivate them to pay. I don't know. It, and also the way that the article kind of talks about it is it appears that the defenses against encryption have gotten stronger, whereas the defenses against DLP exfiltration are still very weak for most companies.
yeah, absolutely. And they talk about how the 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 industry is really pivoting around easy detection or rapid detection and broad detection of malware once it's actually been identified. The industry reacts pretty rapidly, and the way this industry has evolved is such that if you're a ransomware as a service operator and your toolkit gets discovered, then suddenly you're not you don't really have a compelling service anymore for your customers who are actually the ransomware attackers. But what is not clear to me, by the way, is that this this new retread or this new approach is again much more focused on I would call it living off the land, not really focused on leveraging malware. But I I guess what I'm struggling with is where how does that economy stick together? Like I don't understand the function of the ransomware as a service operator if there isn't a malware toolkit involved. And so one of the questions I had as I'm reading this is this starting to cut out that quote service provider, and we're seeing attackers actually, launching these attacks on their own, or is there still some function? And I'm sure hopefully somebody in the audience here will give us an email or whatever and let us know. But I just wonder if is this also, you know the harbinger of significant changes in the economics in the ransomware industry, as it were.
Could be. Could also be that this particular vendor writing this particular report is just trying to get some headlines.
That never happened, does it?
I hate to be cynical about it. The other thing that was interesting in this report that I found, though, is that tactics that were originally used primarily for large targets, large enterprises that were being victimized, are starting to go down market, which makes sense, right? I mean, once you've kind of broke ground with a tactic and a technique against a large enterprise, it becomes somewhat commoditized in these toolkits and starts going down market. So I can see that. So I don't know. The other thing they make a point of is that DLP is not often put in place at smaller organizations or mid-sized organizations, which is true. DLP is a pain in the butt to manage. So, um, and they sort of imply that DLP would catch some of this exfiltration work. I get that. It's probably true.
I'm
And I
say
think a lot
something
of, yeah,
controversial and say I've never seen a DLP deployment that wasn't just a checkbox.
yeah. Anytime I've run into them, it's been very noisy. It takes a lot of staff, takes a lot of time. You're running down a lot of false positives, a lot of normal behavior. I think it depends on the data structure you're dealing with. If it's very structured data, like credit card information, that's easy, right? But otherwise, it's a lot of like behavior anomaly detection of yeah, I'm sure that there are DLP vendors that will light me up on LinkedIn saying, no, no, you need to look at mine AI enabled blockchain powered super duper DLP. Um, but
Yeah,
yeah, I think it very,
what I've always seen is the 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 only workable approach is using DLP tools as kind of a blunt instrument. So it's, you can or cannot write files to a USB drive. You can or cannot upload files to a webmail client. And it's those sorts of things that are, again, blunt instruments, rather than, again, like if you're a bank and you have a very standardized set of information, maybe that does make a big difference. But a lot of the companies, and I've been exposed to a lot of them. Uh, it's not been a workable thing, because the kinds of data that they have to work with is just so varied, that you end up with, like you described it, a big noisy mess.
yeah, I think so. But hey, uh, I think for bigger organizations, they have a lot of compelling pressure to deploy DLP. And I think you're right. It does become a checkbox. I don't know how. I mean, it it's one of those where I think it has a lot of false negatives and a lot of false positives, and it's very noisy, and you need a lot of staff time to manage it well.
Well said. Well said. And by the way, I've in my career I've done many DLP deployments, and to a T, the vendors never really, like, clearly articulate exactly how resource intensive these are.
No, but they do a very good job of trying to make sure that you have very clear success criteria that aligns with their product before you start the POC.
That's certainly very true. Anyway, I'm not saying that they're worthless, um, but I would say you got to go into it with your eyes open if you are going to do a DLP deployment, because typically they're very dependent on being on the agent being on all of the points of presence, as it were, like your laptops or your gateways, whatever it is. And again, the only way that I've ever seen it work effectively is as a blood instrument. And I will tell you, not a lot of organizations have the intestinal fortitude, as they say, to actually stick with it, because that's a pain in the rear end.
Yep, I would agree.
All right, so moving on to our next story, which comes from Bleeping Computer, and the title here is "Over 12,000 Carrier Control Firewalls Exposed to Exploited RCE Flaw."
That never happens with firewalls. What are you talking
Oh my
about?
gosh. So, was it last time or two times ago you talked about how I should, kind of do the David Banner thing, go town to town and help them solve their exposed control panel problem. I'm
I,
really
I'm still
starting
I'm
to think
still
that's a
bought into
thing.
that plan. I am very much on board with that plan.
Yeah. So this is very interesting. There's multiple layers to this. If you click through the links, you can actually get to the original blog post, and the original author does a great job of kind of explaining the methodology of developing I guess identifying the vulnerability, to be more precise, and then crafting the exploit. And when you read it, it's kind of ugly, because on its face, the vulnerability this person found was a reflected cross-site scripting issue in the admin control panel, but it was made worse by the fact that there was an 8 or 9 year old um, file inclusion or file upload vulnerability that turned it into remote code execution. Now, it still,
Perfect.
by the way, requires an administrator to be logged in and tricked into visiting a web page that the attacker controls, which I don't think is as clearly articulated in this maybe as it could be, although they do call it a one-click RCE. But what they're really saying there is a an administrator would have to visit with a logged in session. Would have to visit an attacker controlled website, and if they did that, then the attacker would actually be able to run arbitrary code on the firewall. And it is yet another example of why these should not be exposed to the internet. Now, this was responsibly disclosed. It was patched. And one of the challenges that's pointed out in the article here is that though the patch exists and has existed for some time now, there, at least at the time of this writing, there were still tens of thousands, over 10,000 devices exposed to the internet that were still vulnerable.
Yeah. And it's also interesting to me that they didn't really see a lot of exploit activity until somebody's proof of concept came out, which I'm not arguing against proof of concept code, especially when it's responsibly disclosed. But if you're trying to rank prioritization for vulnerability patching or management, known exploit vulnerability code and POC out there probably should put it pretty high in your list to go fix. And I don't know that a lot of people are looking. I think if you have that level of sophistication, look at that, you're probably not in this position to begin with.
Probably not. But I think it highlights a couple of things. One is timely patching of your edge devices. And by the way, we've seen plenty of instances where there's been 0-day vulnerabilities that affected these edge devices, and I don't think this is necessarily the case in this instance. And it's look, I'm not going to mince words. It's hard to avoid the 0-day issue, right? But like, this is not that. The issue is the patch exists, and you really have to have a process in place. And I think a lot of organizations are somewhat hesitant to patch these things because they tend to be maybe sensitive to downtime or changes or what have you. But like, that's more reason why they're in a placement on the network that says they're a sensitive control. They need to be handled in a timely manner. And the other thing it says is, geez, do not expose these management panels to the internet.
Look, man, how else can I manage it remotely?
I don't know. I don't know.
If it
I
wasn't meant to be exposed on the internet, why does it have an IPv4 address?
True. I
It's
don't
like
know.
bears. If they're not friends, why are they friend shape? Come on.
Okay. So look, I don't know. I don't know what the industry has to do here. I'm this is generally or genuinely a question, right? What has to happen in order for the message to be to be well understood? It's not hard, right? I understand that it's not as necessarily as convenient, but good heavens, like, this is the ultimate shoot yourself in the foot IT problem. I mean, other than running Active Directory,
I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I think cloud has made this much worse. I think a lot of people have gotten very used to all things are exposed to the internet and relying solely on the administrative login function of whatever that device is to protect it.
that's true. That's zero
We've
trust, isn't it? Yeah.
yeah, we've
Right.
we've lost the concept of attack surface management and defense in depth or whatever buzzword you want to throw at it. That when you and I started in this industry, there was this concept of a perimeter firewall and things behind the firewall very rarely, if ever, were exposed to the internet. We have completely flipped that upside down. Now, a lot of cloud first companies or SaaS providers, we've taught everybody everything can just be open to the internet and just rely on strong logins. Hopefully, so I don't know what's
Mostly.
going to change it. Yeah, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I honestly, I think the vendors, one by one, are going to keep getting free code audits like this, and slowly, hopefully, we'll get stronger. But I don't know what's going to make it better. I don't. We seem to forget lessons we've learned in the past in the IT security world, and we have to keep relearning them. Or the paradigm shifts so rapidly that it no longer feels like those lessons apply, and we reject them in the interest of some convenience, efficiency, economics, something, and then we roll the dice.
I guess maybe I'm just getting old, but it feels really disappointing. Like I'm very disappointed in the
You're not
industry
mad.
that we're here. I'm not mad. I'm disappointed. And
I think this is an evolution of the cloud migration and the SaaS migration.
I I'm sure you're right. It doesn't make it any
Yeah,
less disappointing.
that's fair. But the upside is maybe that'll normalize, and in 20 years from now, we'll get it right.
That's entirely possible. Entirely possible. There'll be nothing left that hasn't been hacked by then, but
Well, I'm fairly certain, we're about to make a bunch of the same mistakes again with AI that we've made previously with all sorts of other information security disciplines. So
yes. We're
here's
good at
here's
that, by the way.
here's the fundamental problem, I think. If we Because a lot of people point this out, like what if we treated IT and IT security like a true engineering discipline and actually had code, like not code, but like, building code and electrical code and plumbing code. And you could do that, but you would slow down innovation dramatically. And that's not what we're willing to trade off. We will innovate at all costs, and we have to accept these risks and these problems, and with the assumption that innovation benefits outweigh the costs. That's up for the listener to decide. But that's what I think.
Yeah, it's to some extent, it's. I mean, so I'll say intuitively, I think you're right, but at the same time, I feel like obviously getting hacked is not like it's not the same thing as your house burning down, right? And I'm not trying to equate
Yet, give it
those
time.
things. Certainly, that could happen, but it is kind of like the desire to move fast is the mental picture I have in my mind is like just the stacking you know um, extension cords and
Mm-hmm.
power strips and whatnot on top of each other because we don't want to take the time to to rewire things correctly, and then we're surprised when something catches on fire. And to some extent, I think that it feels like that's where we're at, and we are trading off speed and agility for for safety, and maybe that's just where we're at. But I also feel like there is a lot of these things are not. It's not necessarily to put into a code. It it should be as an IT professional. Well, certainly, if like this is a problem that is that arises as a result from companies that have no IT departments assembling a network and they get they get compromised. Like that's you okay, I get it, right? But I just don't understand. And again, maybe it's because I'm old and I lived through a different time in IT history, which is a weird thing to say. Um, I I I don't understand the thought process in people's minds when you look around, and it's not hard to find. You can just open up any goddamn news site these days and see instances of companies getting hacked by this and thinking, "Oh, well, hey, you know what? I'm gonna deploy my new firewall, and because I have to manage it from home, it's gonna be open to the internet." I just don't understand. I just don't understand.
Couple thoughts. we bias towards the problems because we live in this world. So let's say only 5% of companies are having this problem. 95% are not. So those executives and those leaders aren't seeing the problem the way we see it because we live and breathe it every day. The other thing I would say in terms of, IT professionals should know better. I mean, you're touching on something interesting, and maybe if we had like a course, and if you pass the course, you could get a certificate that alleged that you had this information. That's what we
I,
should. You know what, Jerry?
I see where you're going.
No, the point is, again, there's no professional barrier to entry for IT or security, and in some ways that's good. We saw this problem in the early 2000s with everybody and their brother getting Microsoft admin certs, and cert mills just churning out people to get jobs, and there are consequences for that. So I think again, this all comes back to speed and efficiency and risk tolerance by a lot of businesses. And we see just one side of it, right? We're not sitting in that CEO seat trying to keep a company alive and meet payroll.
Fair enough.
I
Fair
mean,
point.
you're trying to keep your organs alive.
It's true. And those of you who are watching the video just saw the 1.21 gigawatts of plant lights turn on.
It's going to be a Little Shop of Horrors situation in your house pretty soon, I think.
Oh my gosh. The plumeria takes up half of my office now. I actually do not know how I'm going to get it out of because I take it out in the spring. I don't know how I'm going to get it out.
It's not. I mean, you're actually the start of the fungal takeover from The Last of Us. That all that growth. That's just your house is patient zero.
That's where it all starts. I mean, look, the world has to end somehow. All right, so moving on. Our next story comes from Ars Technica, and the title here is "What is device code phishing and why are Russian spies so successful at it?"
Tell me.
Oh, so device code phishing or device code authentication is a specification, a component of a specification for OAuth. So if you've ever tried to log into, let's say, Netflix or Apple TV or many of the other services on your smart TV or what have you, you'll be familiar with the idea of being presented with a QR code or a link or a code that you have to visit a website and then type in the code, and then that in turn authenticates your TV, the app on your TV to be able to watch your horrible Netflix show.
Excuse me.
I'm assuming it's horrible. So
you leave my true crime alone.
So this, by the way, has been exploited for some period of time by the criminals, but what is now happening is this technique has been adopted by minimally the Russian, I guess, intelligence agencies, allegedly, as a means of phishing. And so what they're the other thing they're doing is they're approaching this in a much more refined manner than has been done in the past. The way
wait, are they
ahead.
going after my Netflix? Why do I care?
They're not going after your Netflix. They're going after your right now. This article is talking about people's Microsoft 365 accounts being hacked.
Sneaky.
Yes. So the way this is playing out is the target or the victim is sent an invitation, or they're typically they build up to it. So the adversary builds up a rapport, and typically they're portraying themselves as some sort of an authority figure. And they give a bunch of examples, like they're from the United Nations, or lots of different government and different types of government entities and whatnot. And that in turn, that relationship in turn gets an invitation to a chat group, and then ultimately the lure is being invited to participate in, it's usually a Microsoft Teams meeting, and they're sent a what looks like a very convincing Microsoft Teams login with a link that you have to click. And once you click on that link, you have to enter the code. But if you're not paying close attention, what that authentication is, it's not enabling your ability to register to join a Microsoft Teams meeting. It's actually authenticating the the adversary's device to your Microsoft 365 account. And once you fall for that, the adversary has, basically full access to your account, all the privileges that you have to your account until that token is removed.
So these various third parties have this device code token enabled as a login possibility, and they're leveraging that protocol, tricking you into authenticating their device, and now they have access. Yeah. And they don't need the password. They just need,
Don't need the password.
yep, just the code.
So
Well,
it's
that's just mean. It's mean. Tell them to
very
stop.
it's very underhanded. It's not
It is.
fair. Not fair. So this article has some images of both some of the chats that have led up to this attack, and then what some of the actual lures look like. And again, they're very convincing. If you're not paying attention, it's going to be fairly easy to fall for. So, yeah. What?
So, what are some things we could do to try to avoid it?
Well, Microsoft has a bunch um, of ideas, recommendations. So they let's see. Microsoft recommends blocking device code flow authentication, which
So just
um,
turn off the functionality entirely if you don't need it.
correct, correct.
Yeah.
They say, you should ask them if they're Russian agents before you talk to them. I think
That is clever.
it's a very good one.
Because if they say no, they're lying. If they say yes, don't give them the code.
Yeah, they recommend enabling the sign in risk policy, which will apply additional levels of authentication based on risk. Um, requiring multi-factor authentication obviously is very basic, but I don't think that really helps in this instance. And then of course, Microsoft certainly is willing to help you more by selling you additional features like their XDR and whatnot. So I think the most effective mitigation recommendation is to ask them if they are in fact Russian.
In Russian.
Yeah, you have to use Google Translate, but yes.
Ideally with like a Moscow accent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, we all have access to LLM. There's no excuse anymore. There's just no excuse anymore. So, anyhow, something to be aware of. New technique. Right now this is the domain of at least this particular type of attack is being performed by Russian intelligence. But now it's kind of out in the open. I would very strongly suspect we're going to see a lot more, less sophisticated actors using this against all sorts of targets. So, if you may take some solace and you're not a likely attack victim or target of Russian intelligence, um, I don't think that's going to help you for very long, because I think this is going to be adopted by, many different adversaries in the coming days and weeks, months.
We are just a mountain of good news on this show.
Well, I mean, look, if if the word world weren't a dangerous place, we really wouldn't have anything to talk about.
This entire show has been leading up to launching our own alcohol line to help people cope with the bad news we give them.
It's very true.
Defensive security vodka, defensive security whiskey.
It be is be high proof, 190 proof. Help you get through those long APT attacks.
Goes perfect with breakfast.
All right, our next story comes from Dark Reading, and the title here is Open Source AI Models, Perfect Storm for Malicious Code and Vulnerabilities. A couple days ago, maybe a week ago now, there was a report by a company who, of course, can help you out with securing your AI endeavors. Identified a couple of malicious machine learning models that were posted up into Hugging Face. And
Which is such a name. I just got to say for the record.
yeah, what was the game? Right, it brings me back to the
Half Life?
the Half-Life. Yeah, the crabs
Yeah.
that jump on your face, right?
Well, I mean, let's start with Alien and the facehuggers from Alien.
Fair.
Your mom also jumps on my face, but we're not going to talk about it.
I knew. See, I knew it was going to happen.
It's been a long day. It's only Monday. Sorry.
Anyhow, getting past their name, ironically, this particular issue, when you actually trace it back, doesn't impact LLM models. It impacted some other types of machine learning models. But in Python, in PyTorch, there's this thing called pickle. It's a pickle file. It basically is how you serialize and deserialize data. And when you use Python as the vehicle for consuming these AI models, pickle files are the way that you basically interact with the model. And now Hugging Face has some protections, because basically anybody can upload a model and offer it for for download. They actually have some amount of checking in place, looking for malicious scripts that can be uh, implemented in that pickle file. So the adversary here took the very sophisticated step of using 7-zip instead of regular zip, which then made those malicious scripts opaque to Hugging Face's protections, right, or defenses. So yeah, I mean that was very
That's some
sophisticated.
nation state level foo right there, man. That
It's
is.
very sophisticated. Now I will say, by the way, there's been a lot written about this. I'm not sure it's really covered well in this particular article, but the models that were identified in that instance appear to be focused on proving out that attack tactic. It wasn't necessarily intended to be like a um, I don't think they were actually expecting people to download it and use it en masse. It looked like it was was a proof of concept type of thing. So unclear if it was for a researcher, but if you were unlucky enough to have downloaded it and run it while it was there, it would create a reverse shell to a fixed IP address. So the system you're in and on would have attempted to create a reverse shell that calls out to um, an IP address that some unknown actor controls.
Do
But
you think they paid for the license of Seven?
I don't know. I don't know. Good
We'll just
question.
add it to the list of misdeeds.
Really good question.
That's what I'm here
But
for.
I think it's as they point out in this article, it portends a larger challenge with our rush to embrace AI. And in the article, they point out that 61% of companies that are dabbling with AI are using models that come from the open source ecosystem. like Hugging Face. And so I would say, broadly speaking, that as we joked about earlier, the defenses against against attacks leveraging these models is not very well refined, right? Your CrowdStrike agent isn't going to detect probably malicious, a malicious uh, model, right? Unless it's something that's very obvious, like a script that makes a call out to to a fixed IP address with a remote shell. That CrowdStrike should be able to detect that, but that's a pretty simplistic example of what can go wrong. I think the other concern I have is, we're on the kind of like cloud, like we're still on the precipice of what's possible with these kinds of attacks. The adversaries are just kind of feeling their way through right now, trying to figure out like how can I leverage this technology to go off and you know perform attacks. And so I think we're in for a long slog that, again, I think is going to mirror some of what we've seen with the challenges in cloud.
Well, the one thing that occurs to me is something that we've talked about kind of off and on with the open source ecosystem in general is, do you know where your code's coming from that you're getting? And is it safe, right? Now, Hugging Face, to their credit, has some capabilities built in to try to detect malicious code from being shared out of their servers, and kudos to them, but they can't catch everything. So it's a tough one. And again, I don't know how many of the commercial code analysis tools are up to speed on this yet either. It's a whole brave new world, and there's a lot of room for bad actors to maneuver before our defenses catch up. So, it's not what most organizations want to hear, but I would say be very careful and don't just jump into whomever's got some interesting new version of code to play with. You don't know what you're downloading.
Yeah, but as we've talked about several times now, I think there is especially with AI right now, there is a desire to move fast, and I I don't see that changing anytime soon. And in fact, I see it kind of continuing to trend further in that direction. And so what I would say is like we've got to make sure that we're facilitating that rapid movement in a relatively safe way. So for example, you shouldn't be experimenting with untrusted models on production systems on production networks. Like you should ideally be running these kinds of experiments in some sort of a controlled environment so that if it goes horribly wrong, the damage is contained.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
I know. Let's push it to production. What am I saying? Just push it to production. Who
We'll do it
cares?
live.
Who cares? What I've learned. Uh, Soon enough, it'll be AI making those calls anyway.
Hey,
So,
hey, look, those admins or devs are out there with a job. You don't have a job. So who got it right, mister?
I can't argue with that. I just
The
can't argue
logic
with
is
that.
unimpeachable.
I can't argue. Anyway, the main point I wanted to make is, like we're seeing, because of the rapid pace this is developing, we're starting to see attackers sit up and take notice. This particular event, I guess I'll call it, is an indication that it's possible, right? It's not impossible. There are opportunities to weaponize these models for attacks, and so um, we have we have to we have to exhibit some sort of care because I do
Yeah,
feel like this is going to be the exposed to the internet control panels problem of, let's say, the 2030s.
fair enough. And it's good to see the bad actors innovating in the AI space, though. They got to keep it fresh too.
Good point. A very good point. All right. So moving on to our next story. This one comes from a CSO online, and the title here is 24% of vulnerabilities are abused before a patch is issued. Dum dum dum. So we've talked about this a couple of times now. There was a report from using the CISA data. Gosh, probably 2 or 3 shows ago that we talked about similar kinds of results. In 2024, there were 768 CVEs that were reported as being exploited in the wild, which is about 20% above what we saw last year. And of those, about 24% were being exploited before a patch was actually released. And as I said, on one of the segments earlier, it's hard to do anything, proactively to prevent the 0 day, the 0 day issue. The best you can do, in my view, is mitigate it. So, like as an example, we're seeing a lot of these in my experience. We're seeing a lot of these being applied to things that shouldn't be exposed to the internet, like web
Right.
firewall control panels and other device control panels, which historically haven't had the level of security and development lifecycle stuff applied to it that should have been. So that's outside of that. I think we're back to having to um, have plans in place to detect the exploitation, right, or the impacts that happen after exploitation. So like post exploitation activities it really comes down to being able to detect, well, what if somebody does hack your firewall? How would you detect that, and how would you respond to that, and so on.
If only we had a firewall for our firewalls.
I think we're gonna partner with a vendor who offers something like that, right?
That's
That's
intriguing.
what I've heard. Yeah.
A little tease for the audience.
Let's see. So what other points did I want to bring up on this crazy article here? Um, just kind of skimming through. There was something else I wanted to. Oh,
Yeah.
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, I think that this also is another argument for patching rapidly. But it's interesting when you look at the total number of CVEs at release and how many are actually actively exploited. It's such a tiny percentage. And in hindsight, if we knew what that percentage was, our vulnerability management job would be easy. The problem is we don't know, right? So there's this argument of, well, look, only such a small percentage of these are exploited, and look how many active attacks start with phishing and not vulnerability exploitation against software. Why am I spending all this time and energy on patch management? There's a lot of things that go into that. If we didn't spend so much time on patch management, maybe the amount of vulnerabilities that were exploited would go up dramatically. Maybe it's because we're doing such a relatively decent job with patch management that phishing is such an easier or such a higher prevalent technique because that's the way in. That's harder to solve. The other thing is, I think attack surface awareness is really important. And to
Mm-hmm.
your point, like what's exposed to the internet should be your top priority, regardless of what it is. Or consider it, like you were saying, from a lateral movement standpoint, or a what's my post exploit activity once I breach something on the barrier. I think it can be somewhat dangerous to say, well, this vulnerability is deep inside my environment, so it's not that big a deal, or this vulnerability is just a privilege escalation that have to get on the device itself first. Well, those things can happen. So it's a really hard problem to know what to patch, and if you've got limited cycles, it can be very difficult to know where to spend your time. But for God's sake, do the perimeter first.
Yeah, absolutely. I really think the average organization should have a way to prioritize what they're patching. And I know that we all make the joke about how the crunchy hard exterior and the soft, gooey interior. But the reality is, aside from having your control panels exposed to the internet, you don't have the entire freaking internet scanning and trying to exploit things on the internal of your network. And so I'm not saying that those things aren't important to patch and patch fast. I'm saying that it's perhaps less important to patch them as fast as the things that are on the edge of your network, where people can find them programmatically using tools like Shodan. That's the point. And there were a couple of other interesting data points in here, which I found interesting. They said that around half of vulnerabilities are first exploited within 192 days, which I guess doesn't necessarily. And then, by the
192
way,
days
the
of what?
192 days of patching, of a patch being
Okay,
released.
gotcha. So patch comes out, over half.
Over half of the ones that will be exploited. Again, not every
Okay,
vulnerability. Only a subset of vulnerabilities will ever be exploited. But of the ones that will, half are exploited within 192 days. But
so the bad actors are watching for patches to come out and figuring out what to go after.
right. The thing
Okay.
that surprised me was that after 1,000 days, so 3 years, only 75% of vulnerabilities that will be exploited have been exploited, which means that 25% of exploited vulnerabilities are only exploited after they've been out and known about and patched for over 3 years.
Wow. What's going on there?
People aren't freaking patching
But also, the bad actors are finding it worth going after stuff that old.
because it's working since people aren't patching.
Maybe there's just some retro threat actors.
The retro computing movement has its
Yeah,
own malicious element. Yes,
yeah, they just like the classics. They're still working on some Windows 95 stuff.
that's got to be it. Oh goodness. So, what one of the things that this tells me is, look, 0 days are a problem. Don't debate that at
Wow.
all.
Breaking news.
But but there's a huge amount of the problem space that can be solved by patching what you can.
But we suck at it. So
But we but we do suck at it.
it's hard.
Yeah, it's one. So, we don't have we don't have the article talking about it now, but in the past we've talked about other reports that have indicated a lot of successful attacks are against devices that aren't. I may say this incorrectly, but aren't known to the organization. They're not under active management. And so, which is, again, kind of comes back to an inventory control issue, right? You can't patch necessarily what you don't know exists in your environment. And so a lot
Right.
of, I guess what I'm saying is just the fundamentals matter, right? We all want to consternate over like the really hard problem. How do we solve for 0 days and whatnot? But I think we should take a step back and say, like, how do we make sure we understand everything that's in our environment? And how do we make sure that we understand when there's a vulnerability that applies to them? And then how do we make sure that we get those vulnerabilities fixed in a timely manner or otherwise mitigated? I'm not going to
Yeah.
dispute that there's cases where you can't, but look, not all problems require like a super sophisticated AI enabled blockchain in the cloud kind of service. Some things have solutions that just requires some work to enable. And I know patching sucks. We've talked about this also in the past a lot too. Like patching is about the most unsexy thing you can do in the security world,
It's
other
a good
than
thing you
power
caveated.
other than PowerPoints.
Because I had some lists of some other unsexy things I was going to mention, but
I
you threw it in the security world, so you just
Well,
cut
that's
me
why
off.
I saw where you were going, and so I had to just cut
But it's
that off.
important. all jokes aside, patching really, like, it matters. And I know others will argue it doesn't. But and the other thing I would say is we're entering a world where we can automate a lot of this patching. And that has its own risks. I get it. But I think the upsides are there. And we should be exploring those options as much as we can.
And I think honestly, I think we would, but I think we would do well to focus on patching in as much of an automated fashion as we can and applying the smart thinking on how to mitigate the problems that come along with automated patching.
But CrowdStrike outage, that's a black swan event, guys.
Yeah. And it may never happen again, right? You know, that was a bad thing for sure.
How much production risk versus security risk do you balance, right? And if automatic patching really does save your bacon in ways that are tough to articulate, tough to quantify. Here's the problem we always run into is how many attacks did you stop due to a successful patch? Don't know. Very, very difficult to quantify.
Yeah. Yeah. How many planes didn't fall out of the sky because of the TSA? It's difficult.
Well, I think we know that answer. 0.
But it's a hard problem to quantify. That's the point.
Sorry, I'm just being snarky about the TSA. They're fine people. I'm sorry. I take it back. Edit that out. But how many terrorists have been arrested by the TSA?
I don't know. But how many terrorists don't go?
0.
How many terrorists don't try because of the TSA? That's the
All
hard.
right.
That's the hard part with quantifying some of these things. And look, I'm not a fanboy of the TSA by any stretch. I think it's security theater. But the point is back to what you were saying. It's difficult to demonstrate, like, you know, if you were to implement such a process and somebody comes along and says, well, you know, that's a big pain in the ass. We think we could save a bunch of money if we stopped doing that, or the first time you have an adverse consequence from a patch being deployed automatically, there's of course going to be calls to stop doing that, and you'll be in a position of having to justify why you do it, and so you'll really be called to the carpet to show, like, what was the business value? How many times did you stop a problem by having this automated patching? And that could be really hard to answer.
I think it goes back to our first story, which is learning from other people's mistakes and trying to apply best practices, learn from other industry outages and issues. And I think that's your best defense of saying, look, here are the stats, here are the statistics, here's what I'm defending against. This is why I'm doing it. And this is what the industry best practices teach us. The problem is you're typically trying to justify that to somebody who's not necessarily a security person.
But again, I come back to, I think we ought to be trying to find ways of mitigating the problems that come along with that automated patching, rather than trying to come up with ways of handling not patching automatically. Right. So whether that's, you know, test pipelines, or, you know, whatever, you can imagine all sorts of complicated scenarios. But the net point is, that's where I think the big thinking needs to happen, is figuring out how we mitigate the downsides of that automated patching, rather than, again, trying to find some other hokey cat or mousetrap type solution, which is just gonna fail.
I will say, if you are called to the carpet to explain why your auto patch caused an outage, what makes it go a little smoother is bringing a bottle of Defensive Security's handcrafted bathtub whiskey. It just helps the conversation.
Or special blend of fruit juices and punch. Gonna be great.
With botanicals from your own garden behind you.
That's right. That's right.
I don't think we're doing this podcast sponsorship thing right yet, are we? I don't I don't think we're doing it right.
We'll get there. We still have 602 episodes left. Is that right? All right. 700. Shoot. Wow. Can't math today. It comes with not working. Like the brain atrophies.
I'm impressed you're just like showered and dressed.
Well, you can't see the lower half of me, so
Thank Jesus for that.
all right. Well, that is our show for today.
Thank God.
Yeah, mercifully, all things must end. So,
I'm sorry. It's been a rough day. This is why we don't typically record on Mondays after work.
yeah, that's wasn't fair to you, and I appreciate your.
No, it's fine. I'm not trying to give you a hard time. I'm just trying to be funny.
All right, so you can find links to all of the stories we talked about on our website at defensivesecurity.org. Just look for episode 297. You'll also be able to find a link to our Patreon page to donate if you would like to support our show. And just one call out, we have a sister show, which we are looking for additional not victims, guests. Yes, that's the right word. To interview. We are particularly looking for people who are, as Home Depot here in the US would say, are the doers, the people who are in the trenches, who have some experience and ideas and passion about things, rather than the parade. I dare say the nonstop freight train of marketing people offering to put us up with different security company executives to interview. That's not really who we're after. What we're after here are the doers.
Exactly. Hunter, well said.
So if you know anybody, or you are one of them and would like to be there, drop us a line. You can send it to info@defensivesecurity.org. Again, the name of that show is Getting Defensive, the Getting Defensive podcast. It's on gettingdefensive.com and also on our YouTube page, which is Defensive Podcasts at Defensive Podcasts on YouTube.
We're just multi-channel media conglomerates now.
Yeah, pretty much. We have our bid in for TikTok, so which is why we have to launch our liquor line so that we have some extra cash to purchase TikTok. So fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.
What's our current bid? Like $47? Are we up to?
Yeah,
Of what we've offered?
62. I was able to find some extra money.
Oh wow,
$62.
All right. Well, hey,
and the chance, but not just $62. It's also the chance for them to be associated with this podcast, which is
we're paying them an exposure.
Is without value.
Absolutely without value. It cannot be valued.
That's what they call priceless, right? Yes. All right. Anyway, thank you, everybody. You can find Mr. Kalat on online where?
X at Lurg, L-E-R-G, and on your very fine Mastodon instance at Lurg at infosec.exchange, L-E-R-G.
And you can find me at Jerry at infosec.exchange, and we will talk again next week. Thank you. Take care.
Have a great week. Bye-bye.